Hello to those just joining us. Just give us a few minutes here to let others join in, and we'll get started in a few. Thanks everybody for joining in. Just give us another minute or two here, and we'll get started shortly. I just realized I'm not even sharing the screen. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and get started tonight. Welcome everybody to tonight's Jumpstart Germantown JUMPinar. This is our weekly webinar series that's held every Monday night at 7 p.m. We cover all sorts of topics in real estate development, everything from construction to financing to green building. And tonight we have a special conversation with Kelly O'Day, who is a retired environmental engineer. He's going to be covering floodplain issues and due diligence, which is particularly relevant to Germantown and some other areas of Philadelphia. So I'm looking forward to the conversation. And before we officially get things started here, I just want to give everybody the updates that Angie usually does. Our loan programs, both Jumpstart Germantown and Jumpstart Philly, are lending, and we're open taking applications. So be sure to go to jumpstartgermantown.com/loans, and you can find all the loan terms and details there. Sorry, my screen just put up here. There we go. So head on over there, jumpstartphilly.com/loans, and you can find all the loan terms and details, as well as how to apply and find our performa application and everything. And also, if you have any questions at all about the loan program or are interested in our training program, my email is Derek@Philly Office Retail, and Angie, who's usually here, also is Angie @Philly Office Retail. So just reach out with any questions, and we hope to see some loan applications from you guys. But yeah, let's kick things off for tonight. We're gonna have a conversation with Kelly O'Day, who, like I said, is a retired engineer or a retired environmental engineer, and I'm going to get my screen set up for a brief bio and introduce him, and then we'll get started with the conversation. But before I do that, I just want to let you know we're going to have a Q&A session at the end of tonight's conversation. So probably around 7:45 or maybe before then if we speed through things, which I hope we don't do, but you never know. Please submit your questions for that using the Q&A tab on your Zoom toolbar. So you'll see on your screen there's a Q&A, two little chat bubbles. You can type the questions in there while Kelly and I are talking, or you can save them till the end. But you'll have the opportunity to get those answered towards the end of tonight's session. So yeah, I think that's all I got to cover, and we'll go ahead and get started here. So Kelly, our guest, is a retired environmental engineer with a bachelor's from University of Maryland in civil engineering and a MS from Drexel University in environmental engineering. And he's worked as a professional engineer for 40 years in all phases of water quality, water supply, and wastewater disposal in Philadelphia and Boston metropolitan areas. He has been blogging for 16 years, and he started his first website in 2005, which focused on environmental challenges. He has studied global warming to see for himself what the science indicates, and he has also researched and written about plastic pollution and flooding in the East Mount area, Germantown, Ogontz area. So it's my pleasure to have him tonight, and I'm going to introduce him. How you doing here, Kelly?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much, Eric. I'm looking forward to our talk.
Yeah, great. So why don't we start with some relevancy and talk about Germantown and the surrounding areas and what's been happening. I'm sure people have heard in the news about recent flash flooding in Northeast Philly, as well as abroad in Germany and China, as we were just talking about. And climate change is certainly fueling up what flash floods can do and the damage they have. So why don't you start by telling us about that and what's going on in the news and why we should care?
Okay, great. What I'd like to just mention briefly, I really want to send out a thank you to Ken Weinstein because I follow Jumpstart Germantown on Facebook, and I saw a note about a particular property, and I checked and looked on the flood maps, and I saw that it was in kind of a marginal area. And I sent Ken a note, and I was sort of concerned how Ken would react, and he was very gracious and said, "Oh, thank you," basically, and that wound up to tonight's talk. So, what my goal tonight is to sort of let everybody in the Germantown, Mount Airy area understand our flood risks. So, let me start then by talking about what happened in Bucks County 2 weeks ago. There was a 100-year, what's quoted as a 100-year storm hit Lower Bucks and Burlington counties. And as you can see, there were 10 inches of rain in Croydon, which is right along the river. And you can see those other very high levels. This happens to be a radar image that the National Weather Service tracks things. And what it shows is that dark yellow area is a relatively small area. And what I see when I see these kind of diagrams after a big rainstorm, I've been struck as I've learned to look at them. You've got the very light blue, the green, the purple, I guess I call it blue, and then the yellow. That shows you how variable the rain is. And one area, like in Germantown, we might not have seen much at all, and yet they got 6 to 10 inches of rain. So it's almost like a luck of the draw as to when a storm like this comes through, how much you get, and therefore whether or not you get a particular flood. So let's talk a little bit about this area, which was close to us. 60 homes were flooded out, so I think it's important. I've shown on here the Wingahocken watershed, which is what Mount Airy and Germantown are in the Wingahocken watershed. You may not have heard of it because it was converted to a combined sewer, but it is still there and it still floods. So to our, I guess it'd be our north and east, the Precautions watershed, which covers both Northeast Philadelphia and parts of Lower Bucks County. Now, this particular apartment complex is just across the line in Bucks County. And maybe you can make out part of in the tree line there, the creek, the Precautions Creek is what it's called. The Precautions Creek is actually the border between Philadelphia and Bucks County in that part of Northeast Philadelphia. Now, this flood just 2 weeks ago, and as I said, we didn't see much of it, but they got something like 10 inches of rain in 3 hours. So you can see there the homes, obviously the first floors, and I think these are homes that are on grade. Now, basement versus on grade, very important, is I want you to be thinking about flooding as you think about rebuilding, rehabbing old houses in Germantown. Now, here's a map, and I would encourage you as you think about anything you're going to do in the real estate business in our area, is to look at the flood factor map, and I'll talk about that a little more. So here's Northeast Philadelphia on the left part, Red Lion Road, the Precautions Creek, and then you can see those apartments. Now the flood factor map showed that the five-year storm covered one of the buildings. You can see this building in here. It was already at risk under what's called a 5-year storm. Now, if we look at the 100-year storm, which means that there's a 1% chance that could happen in a particular year, you can see that much of that apartment complex is in the 100-year storm. So whatever you do tonight after this talk, hopefully you'll type into Google, put in flood factor, and it'll bring you up to a site where you can enter an address, a zip code, or a city, state. You can put in, 19119 if you're in Mount area, or 144 if you're in JUMPtown area, and it will bring you to a place where you can actually look at the flood factor for your particular property you're interested in. Now,
Yeah, so I actually put the flood factor link in the chat there. So if anybody wants to look it up and put it as a bookmark, feel free to do so. It's floodfactor.com. And something you alluded to earlier, Kelly, was about the historic watershed that is, beneath Germantown. And I forget what you called it there, but tell us a little bit more about that and how that relates to flash flooding.
Okay, I will do that. I wanted to just sort of stress a little bit about Dutch water engineers are world famous in the water field. Their expression is "make room for the river." U.S. water engineers will often say, "Don't build on in the floodplain."
Mm-hmm.
If you're a Winahawking water engineer, you say, "Protect your basement."
Right. They messed up long ago and gave you problems to deal with, right?
Exactly. So this is a little bit more on that particular apartment complex in Lower Bucks. So now let's go to our own territory. And what I'm showing you here is what's called the Winahawking watershed. Way back when in 1683, when the German immigrants first came here, there was two creeks, the East Branch and the West Branch, that made up the Winahawking Creek. So now you can see Germantown Avenue, you can see Stenton Avenue. None of us ever see the Winahawking Creek because it was converted to a sewer. And I'm going to explain that to you in a little bit. But what that tells you is you've got to be thinking about when we saw the precautions and it flooded with that 10 inches of rain, our creek is now in a sewer. So you can drive right over it and not see it. But when we get those floodwaters, when those high rains, we do get floodwaters just like the precautions. The difference is we don't see it day to day, but it is there running underground.
If you don't mind, Kelly, if I could just ask real quick,
Yeah.
does it being underground and being in a covered pipe or like not exposed, does that help with flooding at all, or does that really not matter? It's going to come no matter what.
It actually is going to come no matter what. It doesn't help with and if you think about a lot of creeks, as we put in a lot more impervious cover, the banks of a lot of creeks got bigger and wider to accommodate the higher flows. Pipes don't get any bigger.
Right.
The pipes were put in about 100 years ago when the best engineering of its time, and frankly today they're just not big enough for our
so it's the same as having a creek run straight through our neighborhood.
It is a creek. It basically is a creek right there. Now, in fact, again, you don't see it, but at that pipe, if it's overloaded, it has to come to the surface, and so it's just like every other creek. So it was covered to solve water pollution problems. Now, in dry weather, when it's not a serious rainfall, all of our flow, that is all of our groundwater, which is going into the sewer, as well as our domestic wastewater, all makes its way down to the Northeast Water Pollution Control Plant, right on the Delaware by the Betsy Ross Bridge. And that, everything works fine, and that gets treated there and goes out into the Delaware River. However, if we get a rainstorm, like we just saw the one up in Bucks County, it's going to overflow. It's going to it'll overflow into what's called the Frankfurt Creek. It's the Tacony, Frankfurt. The Frankfurt is the part down by Juniata Park. And if it's bad enough, it will back up into basements and come out of inlets onto the streets. So it's nothing new. Basically, the creek was there. It had to be buried and covered, but we've got this problem. So today, the Winahawking is one of these unique areas in the city. We have a flash flooding problem with certain big storms because the pipes aren't big enough. And we have a water pollution problem when we get about, let's say, a half an inch to an inch of rain. We'll overflow at what's called T14, which stands for the Tacony Creek, and it's number 14 on the combined sewer overflow. So we have a combined sewer, which is both a stormwater and sewage. And in rainfall events, we do have a pollution problem coming out of our an overflow. Now, this is what T14 looks like. again, that's the overflow. If you could go back 100 years, you would have seen that would be the creek coming out. But again, what happens is all the flow that would have come out there is diverted to the sewage treatment plant, the wastewater treatment plant, because it's contaminated water now that it's in a sewer. Now, let me just go a little bit into the history. You could, if you ask me a certain question, I'll go on way beyond our talk time here, but this is an old map from 1777. What I want you to think about, you can see the Winghahawken is there very clearly, the Frankfort Creek, and then we have the Delaware River in the lower right. You can see the Schuylkill on the left side. We can also see our wonderful Wissahickon. But the Winghahawken was there in 1777. Now that was already about 90 years after the immigrants started coming. So we have to be thinking about, there were no sewers back then. We had first of all, we had dozens of people, then we had hundreds of people, then we had thousands of people with no sewers. So what happened by 1889, the Winghahawken was a grossly polluted creek. We've got no sewers, we've got thousands of people living there. You can guess for yourself. So it was called the Winghahawken fever by people when they got sick. They blamed it on the Winghahawken. Physicians actually condemned the creek, and the Board of Health condemned it. So in fact, it had such a bad reputation that it was 200 years of people moving in and so forth and not having any sewers or anything. And so the conclusion at that time was we got a culvert in, which means that they just basically took the creek and they put it in these very large pipes. These are very, very large pipes, and then brought it all the way down to where I showed you that outfall at Frankfort Creek. So what I want you to get is why we have a very unique situation in our area, and there's some areas, Mill Creek in West Philadelphia is another similar area. There's a number around the city. What you would say is, where's the creek? We can't see any creek here. Now, keep your eye on that yellow circle there, because that little circle will tell you this was the building, the same building in 1918. 1918, this was probably only 10 or 15 years after that sewer went in. That's a 14-foot diameter sewer, which handles even today, because it's been repaired since then, obviously. But what I want to get across to you, there's no floodplain. We all know when we go to the Schuylkill River and we see East River Drive and West River Drive, very nice floodplains. And those are places where floodwaters can be. But in our particular case, we don't have those floodplains. So it in fact comes up into the street, comes into people's basements, first floors and whatever, depending on the magnitude of the flood. So we don't have what they have in the Precautions. Now, it can be very dangerous and sometimes it can be life-threatening. Here was a flood related to a hurricane, I think it was Lee, in September of 2011. A young woman was driving home at night, and a 27-year-old woman happened to turn the corner at Haynes and Belfield, and her car got flooded. She drowned in that car. Just a terrible situation because the sewer system was basically overloaded, just could not handle it, and the water backed up. In that particular case, that blue line there shows you the church that is right at the corner of Belfield and Haynes. That gentleman is standing there. That's actually the water line for how high the water was. And so this poor woman was a victim of drowning because obviously cars these days, if you lose the power, you may not be able to open the door. So here's a little broader view just to get you familiar. If you're familiar with Tague Lumber, which is in that area, and there's a Rita's right there on the corner at Belfield and Haynes. What I did to help myself understand is I figured out what the flood level looked like for that particular flood. And so, and doing some simple calculations, I could get the idea of how extensive it was. And so somebody driving into that area, unaware that there's a creek underneath, it proved to be just an awful situation. Now, this is a building right there again. You can see the Rita's is off there to your left, and the church that I showed you, the blue line, is just beyond that telephone pole. And there was a building standing there, lost their, they had terribly flooded out. And so what can be happen to us is we don't see that. Whereas if you live near the Wissahickon, nobody lives right next to the Wissahickon. They live, quite a ways away. And the Pequessing, but even the Pequessing up there in that apartment complex, they were living too close to the creek.
Okay, so why don't we bring the relevancy back to the people in this call, and obviously
Yep.
our main audience here is developers, but this applies to homeowners, landlords, builders in the area, whoever owns property or has a say in that area. How should they approach this problem, and how should they approach flooding protection in the historic Wingahaken Creek?
That's great. I'm really helpful. That very helpful, Derek, because this is it's like an unknown problem.
Yeah, that's what I
Some
was
people know
saying.
about it, but not enough people know about
Yeah.
it. So my goal.
What I was related to is it's kind of like a doomsday prepper, like someone like trust me, I believe you, but it's kind of like you're always saying like, oh, it's gonna happen. How do you protect yourself when it finally does happen?
Right. That's really what I want to do. And my goal tonight is to say to all of the builders there, please keep building, please keep rehabbing. We need many rehabs, but there's some things to do to be smart about it, and that's what I really want to sort of pass on to you tonight. This happens to be a brochure put out by the city's flood risk task force just for Germantown, because the message to you is that Germantown's problems are different than the Pequessing problems up I talked before. But now when I say Germantown, it's Mount Airy, Germantown, and Ogons, which I'll show you in a few minutes. Now, when you can see on this chart, they describe several things you can do and what to be prepared for. And I want to talk about those so that our viewers tonight are thinking about work. I don't want to discourage anybody, but I want to encourage them to how to do it smart. Sure. So the first thing, though, is we got to talk about climate change. Climate change is real, and for us, they say our temperature is now more like what it used to be in Atlanta or someplace, and that's not comfortable on hot, humid days. But in building a building, the rain events are really the key thing we have to worry about. So this chart shows you Philadelphia's top 30 rain events, starting from about 1873 to 2020, and you can obviously see we had a big one in 8 inches. But typically, and what I want to get across is, in the first 66 years of the record, there were 10 records. In the next 64 years, there were another 10. In the last 16 years, we've had 10 of these top 30. So if we've got a record over 150 some years, 16 of the top 30, or 10 of the top 30 have occurred in the last 16 years. That to me is clear evidence. Our storms have changed. Now, this is basically Philadelphia International Airport. And what I showed you before with that radar, you remember with those multiple colors, obviously it varies. But if this is one place, the airport, year after year after year, it tells us something. It tells us that we've actually got a lot more intense storms now than we did in the past. And then I've also included over here just when they talk about, from a design standpoint, the 25-year, the 50-year, 100-year storms, that gives you the idea from a design standpoint. We would have said a 100-year storm is 6.2 inches. We found, obviously, in the Bucks County, it had 10 inches. So the problem for hydrologists these days is with the change in climate, we've definitely got to rethink our numbers of the sizes of storms. So, all right, now with all that as background, you're thinking about redoing a house, getting a house, redoing that house. How do you go about evaluating it? Now, I can't make you an engineer overnight, even over a week. But what I could do is give you the right questions to ask people, okay? That's really what I want to do. So I've got 6 points here for you to think about and get the right answers that you can get from people. The first is, what are your potential flood entry points? Sewer laterals. In a combined sewer area like the Wingahaken, there's actually a direct connection between your sewer lateral leaving your house and the creek. Now, in a sanitary sewer system, that's not the case, but in a combined sewer system, you're actually connected to the historic Wingahaken Creek. And so when the Wingahaken Creek comes up, that water can back up into your basement if you don't take the right precautions. The second part of it is surface water. In other words, as the water comes out of the sewer onto the street, if it gets high enough, It can find basement doors, windows, vents, cracks, and other openings and get in that way. So you've got to be thinking about how to seal those up to protect. Now, so once you've walked around your house and you've really thought it through, where can water get into my house? The next thing is to examine the flood factor map, and Derek's giving you the link to it. You put the address in, and they will give you a map of right in your vicinity, and it will show you, are you out of the flood area? Are you in it? Where are you? And what's the relative level? And they give you, it goes from about, a few inches to over 3 feet. Now, then the third part of this is to go through what are the elevations? Does your property need a backwater valve, flood proofing, and then flood insurance? So I'm going to walk you through how you would ask a engineer or somebody, an architect, somebody really a skilled person to go through that. So the first thing we do is we look, well, where's the curb cleanout? The curb cleanout is also called a trap, and that you'll see in front of your house someplace, or that's actually your sewer lateral connection. And that's actually it's a fresh air inlet. Turns out that sewer systems have to breathe, and that's one of the sources of air getting into the system, and there's one for every lateral connection. Now, the other things you want to look at, and this happens to be off of Sprague Street, there's a door that's, is that door at risk or not? Is that window at risk? And if around the back, there's also a garage door. So now here is the flood factor map for that exact property on Sprague Street. And it shows that at Sprague and Slocum, there's about a 3-foot level of flooding above the street level for the 100-year storm. So now that you know that, you say, okay, my area is subject to about 3 feet. What does that mean for that door that I showed you? And what does that mean for the window and the garage door? And so what you do, and this is where you may need an engineer, is a topo map, a topography map, to see what are the relative elevations. And so that's where you really need to go through and sort of say, okay, I've got a 276 foot elevation at my street. It's going to be 3 feet of flooding on the street. What does that mean for my windows and doors and my garage door and so forth? And so what this does is this says, all right, I've got these different locations I've got to worry about. I got a door that best of my judgment from looking at the topo map is about 278, the window's 280, the garage is 279. Now, what's the flood risk elevation for my property? My estimate is it's 279 feet. Anything below 279 feet, water could get in. If it's above the 279, I'm not concerned. So what that says to me, I would definitely be worried about my side door as being exposed to floodwaters that could in fact get in, and the garage door. Garage doors are something that could well be a risk. So you want to look at those and make sure you've protected them. But also in a close examination, you might find there's some vents, some dryer vents, other kinds of openings. You have to really look very carefully to make sure you catch those. Now, the other thing you got to worry about is your sewer lateral. The sewer lateral, in this schematic, it shows you we have a house, we've got a sewer in the street, and we've got a sanitary and a stormwater lateral. In our case, it's actually both of those are combined. We only have one sewer for both storm and sanitary. And so what happens is we need to find out, and this is in the plumbing code, and many people may not, I truthfully wasn't as aware of this as I am today. I don't go around reading the plumbing code, but turns out it's very, very important to us. And the plumbing code says if you have any fixture below the fresh air inlet termination elevation, what the hell is that? You have to have a backwater valve. Well, it turns out that the elevation of that curb stop that I showed you before is actually the same thing as the inlet termination elevation that's in the code. So what you have to do is you have to find out what's the elevation of my curb stop vent, and then project back to say, okay, do I have anything below that level? If I do, I have to put in a backwater valve according to the code. Now, what I want to make sure is that you ask your plumber, you ask them a second time, a third time, because they may or may not be, completely up on it. But it seems to me, if there was a flood later, people will ask the question, was there a proper backwater valve included? Because it's in the code, so it needs to be included. And that's where the due diligence aspect of this thing comes in. Now here's from the plumbing code, a diagram, a similar diagram, and this one's a little more correct, and it says the sanitary and stormwater lateral. And in this, in order to take this house and make it up to code, you can see those little yellows, they're backwater valves, and there are different ways you can put backwater valves in. There's no question they have to put in because the sink and I guess the washing machine is probably what that in the schematic would be, are below the fresh air inlet termination elevation, right? I'm gonna have to say that a lot more times before I'm comfortable with it, but what I've shown you is it's that cap. You can look at it in the street. It's the vent, basically. It's a trap vent for your sanitary lateral.
If I could stop here for a second, I just want to ask. Again, I'm always thinking about the developer side of things, and if somebody's coming in and purchasing a property, they've only walked through 2 or 3 times. I think it's important that you hit on that there, that you should ask your plumber once, 2 times, and 3 times. That's going to be the person you're going to want to talk to all this about, right? Is your plumber? Is there any other people in the development process that you think you should be in tune to this, or is the plumber your go-to person?
Well, I think the plumber is definitely a go-to person. And if it was a development project, you'd have a civil engineer doing a site plan. This is one of those questions that really needs to be carefully evaluated. And so the project architect might want to look at it and possibly have an engineer look at it. The plumber obviously can read the code. It's not something that the code was modified in 2018. So this is not like a long-term thing, but it is in the code right now. And my impression is that if you've got a significant rehab, you are responsible to meet the code. And I cannot tell you how the inspectors are doing it and how the plumbers are doing it. I just want to raise the question so that from a due diligence, that's why I love that title came from I guess it was either Angie or Ken, Derek, but that's a very good thing to say is, are we sure? Because the worst thing you want to do is have a nicely rehabbed building, and then a couple hurricane comes through, and your new tenants or residents have a flooded basement, and they'll all ask the question, well, what happened? Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing to look at there that I want to point out is the roof leader was disconnected also. So that's equally important, that you should be making sure to reduce the roof leaders going into your sanitary sewer system, because that actually means that you're going to be having both water from your roof going into your sewer lateral. And so you want to really reduce both the roof connection in stormwater, and make sure you've got these backwater valves if you need them. And there's a fair number of them. The water department has estimated 2,700 homes in the Winghahawking area, which is, again, East Mount Airy, Germantown, and Ogons are subject to backwater flooding potential. And so I don't think that there are 2,700 backwater valves in. I really don't know, but I just want to make sure everybody is sort of sensitive to that topic. Now, if you're a homeowner, you may be eligible for a free backwater valve, depending on a particular set of circumstances. And so some of our listeners tonight might want to check and see if they can possibly get be eligible for a free backwater valve.
Okay. So should we talk about flood insurance now?
Yeah, let me talk. I'll talk about both, a little bit about the flood proofing and then the flood insurance.
Okay.
So what we did is we basically walked around the house and we said, okay, what are our risks? We've talked about the backwater valve being a very, very important part of it. The second part of it is, have we got any points that are weak that we can get flooding coming through a window coming through a crack in the foundation that will let water in. So it turns out that Philadelphia has an excellent set of regulations for floodplain areas. Our situation is we're in a flooding area, but we don't have designated floodplains. We have the same problem, but we don't have a floodplain, so we don't have to comply with the floodplain regulations, and yet we're very vulnerable. And so my argument to everybody is, if you believe if you've gotten some evaluation that says your basement is at risk, you should seriously think about protecting the heaters and furnaces, things like you can elevate them, and electrical panels. If you have a flooded basement and you want to turn the power off, guess what? You got to go into a flooded basement to turn off the power. So what I would suggest in that case is you seriously think about, depending on the flood risk of the basement, raising the water heater in the furnace and raising the electrical panel so it's accessible from the first floor, as things to think about. And then the whole idea of floodproofing to say, because for us, the basements are the vulnerable thing. And once that water gets in the basement, it's not easy to get it out. So here's an example of what some of the regulations look like for how to raise them. Now, there are other alternative ways that you can do it. I'm not going to say there's one way over another. But what I'm asking everybody to think about is, if you're in an area that, I've got a flood, I'm 2 to 3 feet of water around my building, that's all it takes to get that water in the basement. And so then the regulations are spelled out in the city's manual. They're not required in the Winahawking because it's not a formal FEMA floodplain, but it's needed in some cases. And so you need to really think about that very seriously. So then the last part of this that Derek brought up was the FEMA flood insurance. A lot of people are reluctant to get the flood insurance. Hopefully, when you look at the flood factor map, you may rethink that. But I also have some good news. The good news is that as of October 1st of this year, FEMA is changing their risk rating method. And it turns out that since we're not in what they call a special hazard area on the flood maps, that our rates for flood insurance will actually be lower than they would have been if it had been a formally mapped area. But our protection, flood insurance, would be just as good. So if you've looked at flood insurance in the past and been discouraged by the price, October 1st, the prices may be more attractive. And if you're in a flood factor area, I would seriously encourage you to think about that flood insurance. And remember, that flood insurance is for the property, not the person. So if you were to start flood insurance, that can stay going with the property as a way to protect future tenants of that house. So I'd like to now shift gears a little bit and talk about how to be Winahawking flood smart. We have different problems. If you lived in New Orleans, they got their dikes, and they've got a whole set of problems quite different. Pequessing has a different. If we lived in the Darby Creek area, we'd have a different set of problems. So the flood problem area is different for each one of us, depending on where we live. So in our area, we have 24 flood-prone intersections, 2,700 basements at risk, and 1,800 properties in the flood flood factor designated flood risk areas. So you've seen these road may flood signs for 10 years. Anybody in this audience that hasn't seen one of these in the Germantown area avenue may not have been paying attention, but there are quite a few of them out there. What I want you to do now is think about the due diligence part. And what I did when I started thinking about who's involved in a real estate activity for rehabbing a project, a house, I thought about attorneys, bankers, builders, civic associations, developers, engineers, the home buyers, the home sellers, insurance, neighborhood groups. You can read as well as I can. But all of us need to encourage and support backwater valves, flood proofing, and flood insurance. For the due diligence, and Derek has said this before, I'm asking that you please ask, what about Winahawking flooding? Just like, when I sent Ken that note about a property that had just been sort of evaluated, it's a nice looking, property, but it was in fact in a flood factor area. And I think we need to keep it re-asking, because when Derek mentioned about what is the plumber's thought about, do we need a backwater valve? If he says no, he might be right, but keep asking just to double check. Like if you hear a doctor say, oh no, it's not a problem, you might get a second opinion. What I'm advocating as we get into this more and more, think about second opinions. The next thing is to please think twice before installing basement bathrooms, living spaces. Basements in our area are flood prone. We got lots of them, but I like basements. But the idea of introducing a bathroom or any plumbing fixtures in the basement does increase the potential of risk of flooding, and living spaces makes it even more of a concern. So it's one of those things you have to take it very seriously. Don't forget to examine your water and sewer laterals as part of your effort, and to recommend the city's lateral and water insurance program. You've done a really nice job on rehabbing a house. 2 years later, they have a sewer lateral problem. That's one of those things. It does happen, but obviously we want to help people and protect people once they've put them in a nice new house. So with that, I'm asking you the idea of let's all be Wingahocken flood smart, because the Wingahocken behaves differently than the Wissahickon. Now both of them, when the waters come, they both come up. People don't live right next to the Wissahickon. They live right next to the Wingahocken, even though they might not even know it, because the sewer is going right down Sprague, Belfield, and they don't see it. Here's a couple of other good sites for you to think about. There's a very good flood management program that the city has. And then finally, there's a citizen flood monitoring, where they try to get citizens to photograph floods with timestamps so that the water department can keep track of these trouble areas. And they actually have monitors that they can put out and stuff. So if anybody's interested in being a citizen flood monitor, just contact me and I can put you in connection with the right people in the water department. So at that point, I want to thank Derek, Angie, and Ken for inviting me, letting me speak. And I'm looking forward to some questions and answers. So thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Kelly. That was a really, really great look at floodplain issues and that word due diligence. We keep on hounding on that word, but I think you're right. It is extremely important. And with these tools like you recommended, the Flood Smart tool and these other various city programs you can keep an eye on. You just incorporate that into your development process. It doesn't need to be like something you do that takes a ton of time outside of it that you need to set apart like a week to do it. You can just work it into what you're already doing, and it's like any risk management, right?
Right, exactly. So we all know about lead, we know about different other issues. This issue, what I wanted to just be one of those things that's in the back of the mind. Gee, let's double check that. Let's get the right people looking around, asking the questions. And it's not like if a backwater valve is a very practical thing to put in if it's needed. And flood proofing is a practical thing to do, because none of us would want somebody coming back. They've moved into their house, their dream house, and a couple of years later they got a problem that might have been preventable. That's what we all want to avoid.
Yeah, I don't think having a backwater valve or any flood proofing is going to turn people away from buying a home. I think it's only good. Yeah, Kelly, it was great having you, and thanks again for joining us. And I do have some questions here for you. So we'll work through these. The first one is coming from Wanda, and she says, all of Philadelphia is a floodplain. It's built on numerous creeks which were encapsulated, as your evidence suggests. Our pipes are old, and we only deal with them when they break. Does Philadelphia have a plan to save neighborhoods? I live in a floodplain area, Eastwick, that needs to be secured because of its proximity to the airport. So is there any citywide plans as far as addressing the issue?
Yes, there are, and some areas, Eastwick is very high on the city's radar screen. I mean, I think all of them are. They're aware of the problems, and they vary. The Eastwick area is definitely in a wider floodplain that's affected by the Darby Cobbs Creek area. And so the city is working on it. It's a tough problem. And but I guess my sense is, as homeowners, we have to be doing everything we can to protect our house as we encourage and maybe in some cases really put pressure on to get citywide things done. But we've got to take some steps on our own as well. So it's not the same problem all over the city. If you live in the Wissahickon, you don't have the same kinds of problems. But if there's a city document that you can look at, that a guide to flooding in Philadelphia, which shows you those problem areas. Northern Liberties is an area comparable to the Winghahawking. Eastwick is an area that's well known. There's a designated floodplain in that area, and so the comments are all very true. But I just think that we have to both work at the individual house level and work with the city to,
Sure.
As we know, there's not a lot of money growing on trees these days, so we've got to all do our part.
Great. And Wanda's next question was a little bit broader, but maybe you have some insight. What climate change plan does the city have? Do you know of anything, flooding or non-flooding related? Because you addressed that a little bit.
There's quite a few plans out there, and I can't speak. Eastwick is one of that. I suspect Wanda knows more about Eastwick's program than I do, because it is one that's been worked on quite a bit. I know they had a recent flood and city meetings and so forth. So I can't give any real insight because I've spent my time on the Winghahawking's problems, but it's on the radar, and I know there are people in the water department that you can contact to talk about the problems.
Great. Next question comes from Keith, and he's wondering, does the city have any liability for flooding that occurs in areas that were once creeks but made into sewers? So where does that fall?
That is a $1 million question. Let me tell, I'm sorry to do this, to give a little long-winded, but in 1923, I might be off by a couple of years, there was a major flood in Logan. The Winghahawking flooded in Logan area. And in fact, it flooded a couple of times. I guess it was really close to 1930. There was a lawsuit by people that were flooded out from the same Winghahawking just farther downstream. They went all the way up to the state Supreme Court, and the state Supreme Court said that basically, I'm not a lawyer, but they said that the city had sovereign immunity. If the capacity of the pipe cannot handle, sort of an act of God, that's not the city's fault. So my understanding of it is that the city is not liable for act of God events. They do everything they can, when a flood occurs and stuff, to help people out. And but so that the city is not held liable so far for any major flood events.
Okay. I'm not surprised by that answer, Kelly. Next question comes here from Dwayne, and they're wondering, is there a list of the 2,700 basements that are prone to flooding, like you mentioned, or is it a map, or is that an estimation?
There's an estimation, and there's a report that's been worked on. It's been a very challenging, let me go back, and when I told you about the 2011 flood in the Winghahawking, there's been a whole series of modeling efforts, and a lot of work has been done. And so the 2,700 homes and the 24 intersections, we have that. We do not have a map today of the 2,700 homes. At some point in the future, I personally would like to see that become available. I think there's a pros and cons on the release of that, because people might feel that it hurts the value of their home if it comes out. What I want to stress to people is it's fixable. In other words, you can put in a backwater valve. You can do some things for flood proofing of your basements and so forth. And in most cases, we're talking to basements that are a real other problem, and they're doable and they should be done. So that data is not available today. It's known, but it's not publicly available. We'll just have to wait and see. And if enough people ask about it, maybe what I would like to see is the equivalent of the factor map, the flood factor map, made by the city for the residents to be able to see where they stand. Right now, we have the flood factor map. It would be nice to have overlaid on that the city's best estimates, but
Okay.
We'll have to wait and see what happens there.
All right, great. Our second to last question here is, the picture of that sewer collapse was scary. Are there any reasons to be concerned about things going on in the subsurface that could affect the structural integrity of the buildings built over or near the buried creek? And she gave the example of a sinkhole. Is that a problem as well, or is it more so the flooding?
Well, sinkholes are part of the whole process that can happen, because the soil can flow into the sewer. The sewer carries it away, so can be part of the process. The good news is that the majority of the sewers are in the streets. So they're in the streets, not under people's homes. I suspect people can find some examples, but by and large, they're not in homes, under homes. And the city obviously watches it, monitors it, and from time to time there are these cave-ins that occur, but they're in the street and not under homes in the vast majority of cases. So I wouldn't worry about my house falling down if that was the kind of question. And any significant depressions could be an indication and something that can be looked at.
Okay. And our next question comes from Nina, and they're wondering, are there any plans to implement stormwater management requirements for new construction that falls below the square footage area already requiring stormwater management? Hopefully I'm not butchering this question. If not, how do we keep safe our homes when new construction is happening around us? What questions can we ask to be proactive?
Okay, that's a very helpful question. We've got a little time, so I want to talk about stormwater and flooding. Flooding is when the stormwater exceeds the hydraulic capacity either of a pipe or the creek, and so the water level rises. The city has a very innovative green stormwater program, and that program is intended to capture the first 1.5 inches of rain in an area that they're providing this. And what that will do is that will reduce the amount of stormwater that overflows. Remember I said at T14 at Frankfurt, that outfall, when we have wet weather, it will reduce the amount of pollution that Winnehaken watershed contributes to the Frankfurt Creek. So that's the good news. It will help on that. The 1.5 inch from an apartment complex may slightly help in flooding, but if this is an 8-inch rain storm, we already know it's 1.5 inches out of an 8-inch. We're still going to have flooding in our basements and so forth. So the green stormwater program is going after primarily the pollution with some benefit on flooding, but it's, I would call it I don't want to say minor, I don't want to dismiss it, but it's not going to protect us from the kind of flooding we're talking about. And so I think the city has been reasonably aggressive, and the caller mentioned the 15,000. What happens in the Winnehaken and in the city generally is new projects over 15,000 square feet have to install stormwater reduction. If it's less than 15,000 feet, they do not have to do that. So there is discussion, and some people advocating lowering the 15,000 threshold for watersheds like the Winnehaken, so that it's closer to what the Darby Cobbs is 5,000, I believe, square feet. Any project 5,000 square feet. That's something that could happen. I think it would probably take city council and action and the water department approving it. So, but I just want to make sure people sort of recognize that we have a pollution problem, which the green stormwater program is trying to reduce the pollution side of it, has a little bit of help on the flood part of it. We've got to also be worried about the flood side of it. And on the flood side, there are major capital programs that are being looked at. What I want to do is advocate that as those are being thought about, which it may be 15, 20 year away kinds of projects, what can homeowners and home builders do to do the best we can to protect the basements and first floors of our new projects as we build rehab our buildings. I hope I answered that.
Great, yeah, that was great. And the last question I have for you tonight comes from Keith, and then we'll close things out. He's wondering, can you spend some time explaining the flood factor ratings on floodfactor.com? And it's okay if you don't know them off the top of your head, but he's just wondering what different steps should you take for, for a moderate flood factor versus a major flood factor?
Okay, I think what I wanted to show when I talked about the elevations is that it's the height of the water. Now, what they've told you is the height of the water coming up and everything. My wife wanted to make sure I mentioned all of this is above sea level. Elevations are based on mean sea level. So when I said the street elevation, I think it was 276, and it looked like there was going to be a 3-foot rise with the flood. That meant that anything below 279 feet would be a concern. And really what that says is if you've got 3 feet next to your house, what that says is I've got to do more to flood proof than if I got 3 inches next to my house. So what it does is it tells you how high is the water going to be. And so you have to look at that carefully to sort of get a sense for, am I talking about 3 foot, 6 foot, 10 feet? We saw the example up in Bucks County. That was probably, it looked to me like I was 3 or 4 feet. 3 or 4 feet can do a lot of damage to a first floor or a basement. It's not getting up to the second floor. It's just, I think for us, practically speaking, we're first floor and basement. And there is some good news. We live in a very small watershed. When the storm goes by, our flood water goes up and then it goes down pretty quickly. So it's not like if you live next to the Schuylkill, it might be a half a day or a day before the upriver flow comes down. We don't have that. Once it's passed through, when we have water coming from Mount Airy to Germantown, down to Logan, and then down to the creek, Frankfort Creek. So for us, it passes by pretty quickly. And so we have a different situation than other areas do.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, I'm going to just give people a sneak peek of what we have coming up with our JUMPinars. Next week, Yvonne Forbes, a local Germantown contractor, will be covering navigating the rise in construction costs. As I'm sure if you're a developer in this call, you're well aware about how expensive construction is becoming, due to supply chain delays from the pandemic and all sorts of other issues. So Yvonne Forbes, a contractor himself, is going to tell us about how to navigate that and complete a quality renovation while keeping costs low. And then the following week on the 8th, we have another similar risk management session with Michael Kogut, who's going to tell us about lead safety requirements for all landlords, because there's been some new city requirements and the city process for lead safety checking has changed a bit. So he's going to cover all those updates. So check out all the upcoming JUMPinars at jumpstartgermantown.com/events. And you can register for those. Are you raising your hand there, Kelly? What's up?
Yeah, just one thing my wife reminded me of. When you hear about a big storm coming, like a hurricane or something particularly, look at your inlets and try to clear them as much as you can, because those inlets are important to get the water away. So it is a practical thing. If you see a lot of trash around them or something, you want to get them as clear as you can, because that will reduce the local flooding on that particular intersection if you can get it cleared away. And if it's actually blocked, the water department can come out and clean them, hopefully before a storm. That's my message to you. So.
Yeah, great. Yeah, that's some last minute. That's good last minute advice of things you can do yourself in the case of an emergency. All right. Yeah, and actually, we're not going to have this available as a podcast, as it was kind of video focused, but you will be able to see the recording at jumpstartgermantown.com/JUMPinars. Tomorrow afternoon, I'll have the recording up so you can watch our conversation here in full and take a look at Kelly's great presentation. And Kelly, I'm assuming it's all right, but can I send your presentation out to the people who registered tomorrow in an email?
Oh, sure. Yep, that's be very good. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, and I'll ask you for some other links, maybe so people can find out where you blog or what your website is, and
Okay.
people know how to get in contact with you. All right.
Well, thank you to the 24 participants. I really enjoyed it, and just let's all be Winnehaha flood smart.
There you go. That's great. Thank you so much, Kelly. Have a good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.